One of the most shocking moments in European history took place on the 16th of October 1793 inside of Paris as the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was taken to the guillotine. The crowds inside of the French capital jeered and hurled abuse at her as she made her way to the nation's razor for her execution. But many across the nation completely hated her. She was a symbol of ridicule and was known for not caring about her people, as she would dismiss their issues and problems, all whilst she was living a very lavish lifestyle, whilst the French people were starving. However, following her execution, the Queen's remains were hastily buried, but what happened to her head was rather sinister but captivating. The fall from grace of Marie Antoinette was unbelievable. She had everything, incredible riches and power, but she was then held inside of the conciergerie prison, a prisoner of her own people. She was an Austrian princess, and she was someone who was considered for exile rather than execution. But in the years before her death, she enjoyed the frivolity and lavish expense of the French royal court alongside her husband, Louis XVI. She became queen 4 years after she came to France, and when she was just 18. Marie at the royal court spent a lot of time gambling and partying and buying expensive pieces of furniture and gifts, and she was even known as Madame Deficit. Some claimed that Marie was not a monster, and she had a great heart, and even adopted some poor children. However, she was someone who many believed was responsible for the issues across the nation. There was a huge amount of suffering in France, and one thing that did not endear the French people to Marie was the diamond necklace affair. In this scandal, a countess had tricked a cardinal to buy an incredibly expensive necklace on behalf of the Queen, and many said that Marie tried to get hold of this huge piece of jewellery without even paying for it, and this dented Marie's reputation further. But then the French Revolution emerged as the suffering people rose up, and events such as the storming of the Bastille occurred, with rebels stealing the weapons of the royal prison and taking up arms, and there were many other events that stood to hurt the royal family and their reputation. The King and Queen of France were arrested in the June of 1791, and they tried to escape to Austria-controlled Netherlands, but the royal family were then held inside of the temple, and the nation was declared a republic. This brought an end to around 1,000 years of monarchy in France, and King Louis XVI was sentenced to death for treason against the French people. He did get to spend some time with his family and children before he was taken to his execution in the Place de la Révolution. It was the same guillotine where his wife was also executed. But following Louis's death, Marie Antoinette was left in prison, and she was then moved to the conciergerie months before her death, and this prison became known as the antechamber to the guillotine. Marie was held for 2 months before she was then brought to trial. At the time, she was 37 years old, and due to the stress of her final months, her hair had gone white and grey with fear, and her skin was also very pale. She was forced to undergo a trial which lasted a day and a half, and she was then forced to sit for 18 hours each time in the courtroom. There were a huge amount of crimes levelled against her, including, shockingly, even incest, and Marie denied everything that was put in front of her. The accusations were documented in literature, and these shocked the nation, but despite giving good accounts of herself to the courtroom, Marie Antoinette was sentenced to death, and she was to be executed on the guillotine. In the early hours of the 16th of October 1793, she was found guilty of high treason, depletion of the national treasury, and also conspiracy against the security of the state. Before she was to be executed at the Place de la Révolution, Marie Antoinette's hair was cut roughly from her head to make sure that the guillotine blade would not get caught. She was then taken to a cart to her execution, and she arrived there shortly after midday and was greeted by the executioner who would take her life. It was the same guillotine where her husband's head had been taken off. The executioner was wearing black, and he would never have believed that he would be executing the Queen of France, who was technically his former boss administering justice across the nation. Her final words were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to," as she stood on the foot of the executioner accidentally. She was then strapped to the board before she was slid under the guillotine blade, and this was then quickly released. Her head was taken clean off, and the executioner held this up to show the crowd, and he claimed, "Viva la République." However, after her execution, the remains of the Queen were quickly gathered up and were then hurriedly taken around half a mile north of the scaffold to the Church of the Madeleine and the graveyard there. It was here that many executed people were buried. The grave diggers were preparing the grave of the Queen, and they then took a lunch break inside of the churchyard, and this allowed Madame Tussaud to sneak in and get her hands on the Queen's severed head. She quickly then cast a plaster death mask of the Queen's remains, and following this, the Queen's headless corpse was buried in an unmarked grave, and it's presumed that her head was placed at her feet, as was done to mark disgrace. In the years after her execution, Marie's burial site even became a tourist attraction, but her head and body was then exhumed on the 18th of January 1815, and she was given then a Christian burial inside of the Basilica of St. Denis, which was a royal mausoleum. But the death mask that was created of Marie Antoinette and the head by Madame Tussaud is haunting, and it shows the Queen following her execution, and shows her with a short cropped hair and her eyes closed. Her face is also marked and her lips are closed shut, and this is the closest image we have of Marie following her execution. But Marie Antoinette was, to many people across France, a symbol of tyranny and evil, and the old regime which was oppressive and not caring about the population. Her spending and family caused chaos with people suffering heavily, and they made things worse by spending huge sums of money on material goods for their own benefit, rather than helping their own people who needed some sympathy and empathy. But during the Revolution, Marie Antoinette was condemned, and she would be executed in front of a huge crowd. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.